At 12:47 p.m. on the 10th of May, 1869, a ceremonial golden spike was driven into a polished railroad tie at Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory. Two locomotives sat facing each other, the Central Pacific's Jupiter with its bright paint and polished brass and the Union Pacific's number 119 black and utilitarian. A telegraph key was connected to the spike. The final blow sent a single word across the country: done. From San Francisco to New York, church bells rang, cannons fired. The nation celebrated the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. Everything seemed normal for a historic occasion. Only a few minutes later, the formalities ended. The golden spike was removed and replaced with an ordinary iron one. The two engines touched pilot to pilot, then backed away. The railroad that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was open. What happened before that moment was far from normal. The road was not built in a day. It was not built in a year. It took 6 years, millions of dollars, and thousands of lives. The ceremony at Promontory was a performance carefully choreographed by men who had spent years competing, scheming, and sometimes fighting to claim the final stretch of track. Behind the gleaming spike and the triumphant telegraph message was a story of corruption, exploitation, and survival. How did a nation still recovering from civil war manage to string steel across a continent? And how much did that steel really cost? The idea of a railroad to the Pacific had been discussed for decades. In 1862, with the Civil War consuming the attention of the country, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. The law authorized two companies to build a line from the Missouri River to California. The Union Pacific would start in Omaha, Nebraska, and build westward. The Central Pacific, already chartered in California, would build eastward from Sacramento. The federal government offered land grants and loans based on the miles of track completed. The more track laid, the more money the companies received. That simple formula drove everything that followed. For the Union Pacific, the man in charge was Thomas C. Durant. He was not a builder. He was a financier, a speculator who understood that railroads were not just about transport but about profit. Durant created a construction company called the Credit Mobilier of America. The Union Pacific paid Credit Mobilier to build the railroad, but the Union Pacific and Credit Mobilier were essentially the same people. Durant and his partners could set their own prices, passing the cost on to the government. The project became a cash machine. The faster they built, the more they could bill. Quality and safety were afterthoughts. The workers who laid the Union Pacific track were mostly Irish immigrants and veterans of the Union Army. They worked under brutal conditions. The plains of Nebraska and Wyoming offered no shelter. In winter, blizzards froze men to the rails. In summer, the sun baked them. Water was scarce. Camps were rough towns of tents and wooden shacks crawling with gamblers, prostitutes, and thieves. Food was poor. Disease was constant. Cholera swept through the labor camps in 1866. Dozens died each week. And beyond the camps, there was the constant threat of attacks from Plains tribes who saw the railroad as an invasion of their hunting grounds. The Union Pacific recorded dozens of deadly incidents. Workers were ambushed, trains derailed, telegraph lines cut. On the Central Pacific side, the challenges were even steeper. The company was led by the Big Four: Leland Stanford, Collies Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. They had money and political connections but little experience with mountain engineering. The Sierra Nevada rose directly east of Sacramento. The only route was through granite canyons and over steep passes. The Central Pacific could not afford to hire enough white laborers. Wages were high and workers kept leaving for gold mines. Crocker made a decision that would define the project. He began hiring Chinese immigrants. At first, the Big Four were skeptical. Chinese workers were small, they spoke no English, and they were not seen as suitable for heavy labor. But the Central Pacific had few options. They hired 50 Chinese men as an experiment. Within weeks, they hired hundreds more. By 1867, over 10,000 Chinese laborers were working on the line. They worked with picks, shovels, and black powder. They hung in baskets over cliffs to drill holes for explosives. They chiseled tunnels through solid rock by hand. They endured avalanches that swept entire camps down mountainsides. In the winter of 1866, a series of snowstorms killed dozens of Chinese workers. The company did not stop construction. They built snow sheds to protect the track, but the men continued to work in chest-deep snow. The Central Pacific also faced a severe shortage of supplies. Everything had to be shipped around Cape Horn or across Panama. Rails, spikes, and locomotives arrived in pieces and had to be assembled on site. The company paid exorbitant prices for nitroglycerin, an unstable explosive that killed more men than it saved. But the Central Pacific had no choice. They had to move through the mountains if they wanted to meet the Union Pacific in the middle. By 1868, both companies had crossed their respective natural barriers. The Union Pacific had driven through Wyoming and into Utah. The Central Pacific had descended from the Sierra and was racing across Nevada. The race became frantic. The government paid per mile, but only for track laid on the eastern side of the meeting point. The two companies began building parallel lines, sometimes within sight of each other, sometimes bypassing each other entirely. The result was a mess. Grading crews from both sides worked past each other. In some places, the Union Pacific built track that curved miles out of the way just to claim more federal subsidies. The government had to intervene. President Ulysses S. Grant, newly elected, ordered a meeting point to be chosen. After negotiations and political pressure, the spot was set at Promontory Summit. The final weeks were a sprint. The Central Pacific had a publicity stunt planned. On April 28, 1869, Crocker and his crews laid 10 miles of track in a single day. It was a feat never before attempted. Hundreds of men worked in coordinated teams. A horse-drawn cart brought rails to the front. Workers grabbed them, dropped them in place, pounded spikes, and moved forward. The 10 miles were completed in 12 hours. The Union Pacific did not try to match it. They were already close. The ceremony on May 10th was meant to unite the two railways, but the tension between the companies was still raw. The golden spike was a gift from a Sacramento businessman. It was engraved with the names of the Big Four. The Union Pacific had its own silver spike. The actual spike driving was carefully staged for photographers. Leland Stanford swung a silver maul at the golden spike. He struck it once. Telegraph operators sent the signal. The country cheered, but Stanford's blow was symbolic. The real connection was made with a common iron spike driven in minutes later. The railroad that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was open, but the cost was staggering. The credit Moblier scandal broke 2 years later. Investigators found that Durant and his allies had siphoned millions of dollars from the government, bribed members of Congress, and inflated construction costs beyond reason. The scandal ruined reputations, but no one went to prison. The Big Four faced their own investigations, but emerged wealthy and powerful. The Chinese workers who had done the most dangerous labor were not invited to the ceremony. They were not mentioned in the speeches. Many of them returned to California to find that their contributions were erased from public memory. Others stayed in the West, building branch lines and working as laborers. The human cost of the Transcontinental Railroad is difficult to measure precisely. Company records are incomplete, but historians estimate that at least 1,200 workers died during construction. Some say the number is much higher. Accidents from blasting, derailments, cave-ins, and sickness all took lives. The number of Native Americans killed in skirmishes along the route is also uncertain. The railroad accelerated the displacement of tribes who had lived on the plains for centuries. Buffalo were slaughtered to feed the workers. Hunting grounds were cut in two. The railroad became a tool of conquest. The railroad itself transformed the country. Before 1869, a journey from New York to San Francisco took months by wagon or weeks by ship around Cape Horn. After the transcontinental line opened, the same trip took 7 days. Goods moved faster. Markets expanded. The West was settled at a pace no one had anticipated. The railroad made the United States a continental power. But the story of the road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast is also a story of what was sacrificed. The golden spike at Promontory became a symbol of progress, but the rail beneath it was laid by men who worked in terrible conditions for men who profited from their labor. The celebration on May 10, 1869 hit a deeper truth. The railroad was built not by a unified nation, but by competing interests willing to cut corners, exploit workers, and destroy lives. How could a project of such ambition be allowed to proceed with so little oversight? The answer lies in the era itself. The post-Civil War United States was a country defined by expansion, capitalism, and a belief that progress justified nearly any cost. The government provided the money and the land, but the companies operated with almost no accountability. The Pacific Railroad Act set standards for construction, but those standards were loosely enforced. The race for miles encouraged shortcuts. Ties were laid on uneven ground. Bridges were built quickly and sometimes collapsed. Trains derailed weakly. The system was not designed for safety. It was designed for speed. And what of the workers who died? Their names are rarely recorded. In the Central Pacific's files, Chinese workers were listed only by number. The Union Pacific kept better records for its Irish laborers, but many were buried where they fell. The railroad companies did not provide compensation. Families were often not notified. The dead were forgotten. The ceremony at Promontory was meant to erase that darkness. The golden spike gleamed. The telegraph sent the message of unity. The photographs show a clean, orderly scene. But behind the camera, the rails were still being adjusted. The grades were still uneven. The road was open, but it was far from perfect. The first transcontinental train heading west left Omaha on May 11th. It carried passengers, mail, and freight. It also carried the weight of everything that had been done to make the journey possible. The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was finally complete. But the questions it raised about ambition, power, cost, and memory did not end with the driving of the spike. They remain with us, embedded in every mile of track that followed. On May 11, 1869, at 10 in the morning, the first transcontinental passenger train departed Omaha, Nebraska. It was a steam locomotive pulling a string of wooden cars. On board were dignitaries, investors, journalists, and politicians. The train would take 7 days to reach San Francisco. The journey was celebrated as a triumph of American industry, but almost immediately problems emerged. The track was not perfectly aligned. At the meeting point at Promontory, the Central Pacific and Union Pacific had left a gap. Workers had to adjust the rails on the morning of the ceremony to make the connection. The first train to cross the continent had to slow down at several points because the roadbed was unstable. In the weeks after the Golden Spike, the two companies argued over who would operate the line. They had no unified schedule. Trains from the east and west ran on different timetables. Passengers often waited hours for connections. The federal government had to intervene again, forcing the companies to coordinate. What happened next was a paradox. The Transcontinental Railroad was supposed to unite the nation. Instead, it exposed deep fractures. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific remained rivals. They refused to share facilities. They built duplicate stations. They charged different rates. The government subsidies had fueled a race for miles, but after the race was won, the companies focused on profit, not service. The first transcontinental journey was a milestone, but it was also a warning. In the summer of 1869, the railroad began carrying freight in earnest. Goods that had taken months to ship around Cape Horn now arrived in weeks. Fresh produce from California reached New York in 7 days. Lumber, mining equipment, and manufactured goods flowed west. The railroad made the Western territories economically viable, but it also made them vulnerable. The railroad brought settlers, soldiers, and speculators. It brought cattle drives, mining booms, and land grabs. The open plains that had sustained Native American tribes for centuries were suddenly accessible by iron rails. By 1870, the full scale of the transformation was visible. The buffalo herds that had numbered in the tens of millions were being slaughtered at an industrial rate. Hunters used the railroad to access the heart of the plains. They shot buffalo from trains, leaving carcasses to rot. The hides were shipped east. The bones were ground for fertilizer. By 1880, the southern herd was virtually extinct. The northern herd followed within a decade. The railroad did not cause the slaughter directly, but it made it possible, and the railroad companies did nothing to stop it. The destruction of the buffalo was not accidental. It was part of a deliberate strategy by the United States government to subjugate native tribes. The railroad was the tool. Troops could be moved quickly, supplies could be delivered, reservations could be enforced. In 1873, the Union Pacific laid track through the Black Hills of South Dakota, land that had been guaranteed to the Lakota by treaty. The track brought gold prospectors. Within a year, the treaty was broken. War followed. At 2:30 in the afternoon on June 25, 1876, General George Custer and his men were killed at the Little Bighorn. The railroad had played a direct role in the campaign. It had shipped ammunition, horses, and soldiers to the Montana Territory. After the battle, the railroad was used to transport the wounded and the dead. The transcontinental line became a military supply route. It was used to enforce the government's will on the plains. The railroad was not neutral. It was an instrument of conquest. And what of the workers who built it? The Chinese laborers who had done the most dangerous work on the Central Pacific were not welcomed in the new towns that grew up along the line. Many were attacked, harassed, or forced into segregated neighborhoods. In 1878, the Central Pacific laid off hundreds of Chinese workers, replacing them with white laborers paid higher wages. The Chinese were accused of taking jobs, driving down wages, and refusing to assimilate. The resentment boiled over into violence. In 1885, a massacre in Rock Springs, Wyoming saw white miners kill at least 28 Chinese workers and burn their homes. The railroad companies did not protect them. The government did not prosecute the killers. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 had already made immigration from China illegal. The workers who had built the Transcontinental Railroad were now seen as a threat. The Irish workers on the Union Pacific faced different challenges. Many had been recruited as immigrants, promised land and wages. After the railroad was completed, they drifted into other trades. Some stayed on as section hands maintaining the track. Others moved to new railroad projects. The work was still dangerous. In 1871, a Union Pacific train derailed near Sherman, Wyoming, killing 23 workers. The cause was a broken rail. The company blamed sabotage, but the real failure was poor maintenance. The railroad had been built too quickly and inspections were lax. The scandals did not end with the completion of the line. The Credit Mobilier investigation had revealed widespread corruption, but the legal consequences were minimal. The politicians who had taken bribes kept their seats. The investors who had inflated costs kept their profits. The Big Four of the Central Pacific, Stanford, Huntington, Crocker, and Hopkins, became some of the richest men in America. They used their wealth to buy influence in California politics. They controlled the state's transportation, its ports, its land. They were beyond reach. But the rail itself was subject to the forces of nature. The Central Pacific's route through the Sierra Nevada was vulnerable to snow. In the winter of 1875, a series of blizzards buried the track under 50 feet of snow. Avalanches destroyed snow sheds. A passenger train was trapped for 2 weeks. The railroad had to hire hundreds of men to dig out the line. The company did not improve the route. It simply worked harder. The cost was passed on to passengers and shippers. On October 23, 1875, at 11:48 in the evening, a Union Pacific passenger train derailed near the Cheyenne River in South Dakota. The locomotive overturned. The cars piled on top of each other. 60 people died. Investigators arrived the next morning. They found that the track had been laid over a poorly compacted embankment. The ground had shifted under the weight of the train. The company had been in a hurry to meet a federal deadline for a branch line. The inspectors had signed off without checking. The railroad paid a fine of $500. No one went to prison. The Transcontinental Railroad was in many ways a miracle of engineering, but it was also a monument to greed, haste, and indifference. The systems that were supposed to protect workers, passengers, and the public were weak or non-existent. The government had provided the money and the land, but it had not provided oversight. The companies operated with impunity. The result was a railroad that connected the coasts but also connected the worst of human nature. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the legal framework of the time. The Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and 1864 set broad goals: build a railroad from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean. But the acts were vague on enforcement. The government could withhold payments if construction was substandard, but inspections were rare. The companies could appeal any decision, and they often won. The courts were sympathetic to the railroads. The judges were often appointed by politicians who had been bribed. Accountability was an illusion. The railroad companies also benefited from a public that was eager for speed. The promise of a transcontinental line had been dreamt of for decades. When the line finally opened, the country was ready to celebrate. The Golden Spike was a symbol of unity after the Civil War. The flaws were overlooked, the deaths were ignored, the exploitation was accepted as the cost of progress. The narrative of the railroad as a triumph was carefully crafted by the companies themselves. They controlled the newspapers, the photographs, the speeches, they wrote the history. By 1880, the Transcontinental Railroad was no longer the only line. The Southern Pacific had built a route through the Southwest. The Northern Pacific had crossed the top of the country. The Santa Fe had reached California. The first transcontinental was becoming one of many, but its legacy was unique. It had proven that a railroad could cross a continent. It had opened the West to settlement. It had accelerated the displacement of Native Americans. It had enriched a few men and impoverished many others. It had left a scar on the land and on history. The Chinese workers who had built the Central Pacific's line through the mountains were eventually acknowledged, but only decades later. In 1969, on the 100th anniversary of the Golden Spike, a plaque was placed at Promontory Summit mentioning the Chinese workers. It was a small gesture. The real recognition came from historians who dug through the company records, the pay ledgers, the burial reports. They found that the Chinese had been paid less than white workers, given the hardest jobs, and denied any benefits. They had been treated as expendable, and yet they had built the road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast. The road itself changed over time. The original alignment at Promontory was abandoned in 1904. The loosened cutoff, a trestle across the Great Salt Lake, shortened the route by miles. The old track was pulled up. The spikes were salvaged. The ties were burned. The Golden Spike was donated to the Stanford family and later displayed at the California State Railroad Museum. The site became a National Historic Site in 1965. Visitors can see the spot where the Transcontinental Railroad was completed. They can walk the grade. They can imagine the ceremony. But the real story is not in the photographs. It is in the ground, the bones, the silence. The Transcontinental Railroad raised questions that still have no easy answers. Who pays for progress? Who is remembered? Who is forgotten? The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was built by men who were not allowed at the ceremony. It was paid for by a government that did not watch how the money was spent. It was celebrated by a nation that ignored the cost, and yet it worked. The trains ran, the goods moved, the country grew, the questions remain. In the final years of the 19th century, the railroad industry consolidated. The Union Pacific went bankrupt in 1893 and was reorganized. The Central Pacific was absorbed by the Southern Pacific. The Big Four died one by one, leaving vast fortunes and complicated legacies. Leland Stanford founded a university in memory of his son. Charles Crocker built a mansion. Mark Hopkins died rich. Collies Huntington lived until 1900, still fighting for his railroad. The transcontinental line that they had envisioned was no longer theirs. It belonged to the nation. The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was not a single track. It was many roads, many decisions, many lives. It was built with iron and timber and human flesh. It was driven by ambition and corruption and hope. It cost more than money. It cost lives, land, justice. And the questions it raised about ambition, power, cost, memory did not end with the driving of the spike. They remain with us, embedded in every mile of track that followed. On August 15, 1900, at 3:17 in the afternoon, a westbound Union Pacific passenger train crossed the Dale Creek Bridge in Wyoming. The bridge was the tallest on the original transcontinental line, a wooden trestle that spanned a deep gorge 150 feet deep. As the locomotive reached the center span, the structure gave way. The engine plunged into the creek below. The cars followed, splitting open on the rocks. The sound of tearing timber and twisting iron echoed across the canyon. Investigators arrived within hours. They found that the wooden supports had rotted from decades of exposure. The railroad had not inspected the bridge in months. There were no eyewitnesses. The engineer had no time to brake. What happened was a failure of maintenance, but it was also a failure of memory. The bridge had been built in 1868, rushed to completion as part of the original transcontinental effort. The wood was untreated. By 1900, the trestle was a death trap. The railroad knew it was weak. They had planned to replace it with a steel structure, but they delayed year after year. The crash killed 43 people. The company paid compensation, but the families of the dead had to sue. The judge ruled in their favor. The railroad appealed and eventually settled. No one was held criminally responsible. How could this have happened? The answer lies in the culture of the railroad industry in the years after the transcontinental was completed. The drive for profit had not diminished. The companies were still cutting corners, still ignoring safety, still treating workers and passengers as numbers. The Dale Creek Bridge was not an isolated case. Across the system, hundreds of bridges, trestles, and tunnels were aging without proper inspection. The government had not mandated regular safety checks. The railroad companies resisted any oversight. The result was a series of accidents that killed thousands. In 1879, a bridge over the Ohio River at Ashtabula, Ohio, collapsed under a passing train. 84 people died. That bridge had been designed by an engineer who had never built a major structure before. The iron was brittle. The train fell into a river of ice and fire. The investigation was slow. The company blamed the weather. No charges were filed. The pattern repeated itself in 1881 when a wooden trestle near Tecumseh, Nebraska gave way under a freight train. The train carried lumber and coal. The engineer died in the crash. The railroad claimed the timber had been struck by lightning. An independent inspector found dry rot in a cracked support beam. Nothing changed. The Transcontinental Railroad had been built as a political and economic necessity. It had connected the coasts, but it had also established a system of operation that prioritized speed over safety. The Pacific Railroad Acts had set deadlines. The companies had met them, but at a cost. After the line was completed, the same mentality persisted. Maintenance budgets were cut. Inspection schedules were reduced. The equipment was run until it broke. The workers were pushed to their limits. The passengers were unaware of the risks. The human cost was staggering. Between 1869 and 1900, the Union Pacific alone recorded more than 2,000 worker deaths on the job. Passengers died in derailments, collisions, and bridge collapses. The railroad companies kept statistics, but they downplayed the numbers. The press reported accidents as tragedies, but rarely connected them to the underlying failures. The public accepted the risk as part of modern travel. The industry had become too powerful to challenge. One of the most devastating disasters occurred on the Central Pacific Line in the winter of 1884. A passenger train was caught in an avalanche near the summit of the Sierra Nevada. The train was buried under 50 feet of snow. Rescue crews took 3 days to reach the site. By then, 40 passengers had suffocated or frozen to death. The railroad had known the route was dangerous. They had built snow sheds over some sections, but not over the area where the train stopped. The conductor had been following standard procedure: wait for the storm to pass. The storm did not pass. It buried the train. The investigators concluded that the railroad had not provided adequate shelters or communication along the line. The company issued a statement expressing regret. They did not change their operations. The problem was not limited to the original transcontinental companies. The Southern Pacific, which eventually absorbed the Central Pacific, had its own record of negligence. In 1888, a Southern Pacific train collided with a freight train near Mojave, California. The cause was a misread signal. The signal had been placed in a location obscured by a rock outcropping. The engineer had complained about it for months. The railroad did nothing. 23 people died. The company's lawyers argued that the engineer should have slowed down. The court agreed. The railroad was not held liable. The system that failed these passengers was not just a matter of corporate greed. It was a system of regulatory capture. The railroads controlled the federal and state agencies that were supposed to oversee them. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created in 1887, but its powers were limited. It could investigate complaints and issue reports, but it could not enforce safety standards. The Commission's first reports on railroad accidents were filled with recommendations that were never implemented. The railroads had lobbyists. The politicians had connections. The public had no one to advocate for them. The human consequences of this system were measured in bodies. In 1889, a Union Pacific Express train derailed near Sidney, Nebraska. The locomotive hit a washout that had been reported by a track foreman the previous day. The railroad had not sent a work crew. The train was traveling at 40 miles per hour. The engineer died instantly. The passengers thrown from the cars were left in the winter cold. 35 people died from injuries or exposure. The company paid a small settlement to the families. The foreman was fired for failing to flag the washout personally. He had left a note in the station. The railroad claimed it was not received. The cycle of accidents and cover-ups continued into the 20th century. The government's response was slow. In 1893, Congress passed the Safety Appliance Act, which required railroads to install automatic couplers and air brakes on all passenger trains. But the act was vague on enforcement. Many railroads found loopholes. The Union Pacific did not fully comply until 1900. By then, hundreds of workers had died because they had to step between cars to manually couple them. The act reduced deaths, but it did not eliminate them. The Transcontinental Railroad's legacy was not just a story of triumph. It was a story of a nation that built something monumental without building the systems to protect it. The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a testament to the limits of ambition without accountability. The men who built it were celebrated. The men who died were forgotten. The rail itself was replaced, upgraded, and eventually abandoned in some places. But the questions about who pays the price for progress remained. By 1905, the original transcontinental alignment through Promontory Summit was no longer the main line. The loosened cutoff across the Great Salt Lake had rerouted traffic. The old track was removed, the ties were sold for firewood, the land returned to sagebrush and sand. The site where the Golden Spike had been driven became a remote marker. Visitors were few. The Chinese workers' graves were lost under the desert. The Irish workers' camps were gone. The only evidence of the railroad was an occasional spike, a piece of rail, a photograph in a museum. The disasters continued. In 1907, a train wrecked near Ogden, Utah killed 22 people when a car jumped the track at a curve. The curve had been designed for slower speeds, but the railroad had increased train schedules to compete with other lines. The engineer was blamed. He had been working 14-hour days. The railroad claimed he fell asleep. The investigation found no evidence of fatigue, but the company's version was accepted. The families of the victims sued. The case was settled out of court. In 1911, a Southern Pacific train crashed through a bridge over the Colorado River near Yuma, Arizona. The bridge had been weakened by floodwaters. The railroad had received warnings from local residents. They ignored them. The train fell into the river. 18 people died. The company's defense was that the bridge had been inspected 3 weeks earlier. The inspector had been a friend of the foreman. He had not examined the supports. He checked a small section and signed off. He was fired. The railroad paid a fine of $1,000. The pattern was so consistent that it became expected. The railroad companies were too big to fail and too powerful to penalize. The government's regulatory agencies were too weak to act. The public was too divided to demand change. The Transcontinental Railroad had been built on a promise of unity and progress. It had delivered on that promise, but it had also delivered a system of exploitation and risk. The road itself was not the problem. The problem was the people who ran it. In 1913, the American Railway Association published a report on passenger safety. The report found that more than half of all railroad deaths could have been prevented by better equipment, better track, or better training. The report was ignored. The association had no authority to enforce its findings. The companies continued to operate as they had for decades. The accidents continued. On the night of December 12, 1914, a Union Pacific Express train struck a landslide near Sherman, Wyoming. The conductor had seen the slide 100 yards ahead. He pulled the emergency brake. The train slowed, but the weight of the cars pushed the locomotive into the debris. The engine overturned. The cars derailed. The fireman was trapped and burned alive. The passengers survived, but the crew did not. The railroad blamed the weather. The landslide had been caused by a rainstorm the previous afternoon. The track inspectors had not been sent out to check the line. The company said it was an act of God. It was not. It was a failure of preparation. The Transcontinental Railroad was not just one road. It was a network of decisions, each one made by someone who chose speed over caution, profit over safety, convenience over conscience. The Golden Spike was a symbol of connection, but it was also a symbol of disconnect. The disconnect between the story the railroad told and the reality the workers and passengers lived. The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was built by hands that were never thanked, maintained by workers who were never protected, and used by passengers who were never warned. The first transcontinental railroad was completed on May 10, 1869. By the end of the century, it had carried millions of people, moved billions of tons of freight, and transformed the American economy. But it had also killed thousands, displaced entire nations, and left a legacy of corruption that would take decades to unravel. The companies that built it eventually merged, reorganized, and changed names. The Union Pacific still exists. The Southern Pacific was bought by the Union Pacific in 1996. The original roadbed is still visible in places. The tracks are gone, but the grade remains. The questions the railroad raised have not faded. Who decides what progress costs? Who pays the price? Who remembers the dead? The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was built by a nation that believed in its own destiny. It was driven by ambition and greed, hope and betrayal. It was a road of iron and blood. And the lessons it taught are still embedded in every mile of track that followed. At 10:15 p.m. on the 12th of August 1939, a Union Pacific passenger train called the City of San Francisco was traveling eastbound through the Nevada desert. It was a streamlined diesel-powered express, one of the most advanced trains in America. It carried 214 passengers and crew from Oakland to Chicago. The train was running on time. The engineer, a veteran of 20 years, had the throttle open. The desert was flat and straight. The speed was steady at 80 miles per hour. Everything seemed normal. Then the track ended. The train hit a washout. The flash flood had torn away a section of the roadbed near the Humboldt River. The locomotive plunged into the gap. The cars piled into it. The streamliner, designed for speed and luxury, was destroyed. The sound of metal grinding into rock carried across the desert. When the dust settled, 24 people were dead. Another 30 were injured. The survivors were pulled out of twisted wreckage by local ranchers who arrived on horseback. The Union Pacific's response was not immediate. The dispatcher did not realize the train was missing until it failed to check in at the next station. What happened? The flash flood had been caused by a rainstorm that afternoon. The Humboldt River, normally a shallow ribbon of water, had risen 4 feet in 2 hours. The washout was at a location known for its unstable soil. The Union Pacific had known about the risk. A track inspector had reported the area as vulnerable to erosion just 1 month earlier. No work had been done. On the night of the crash, a station agent at a small town 20 miles west had seen the storm and tried to contact the dispatcher. He reported heavy rain and rising water near milepost 347. The dispatcher acknowledged the message but did not order a speed restriction. He did not warn the train. The investigation that followed was conducted by the Interstate Commerce Commission. The commission found that the dispatcher had received the storm warning at 9:48 p.m. He did not act on it. He later testified that he considered the report routine. He had been working a 12-hour shift. He had handled dozens of messages that day. He did not recall seeing the warning about the washout specifically. The commission's report stated that the washout should have been detected by earlier track inspections, but the schedule for inspections had been reduced from weekly to bi-weekly due to budget cuts. The Union Pacific had laid off track workers during the Great Depression. The remaining staff were stretched across hundreds of miles. The railroad's defense was that the flood was an act of God. The rain was heavier than expected. The river rose faster than records showed. The washout happened suddenly, but the commission's investigators found that the same location had washed out twice before, in 1924 and 1930. Both times, the railroad had repaired the roadbed without reinforcing the drainage. Both times, no one had suggested moving the track or installing culverts. The pattern was clear. The railroad knew the risk and chose to accept it rather than spend the money to fix it. The human consequences were measured in the details. One of the dead was a mother traveling with her 2 children. The children survived, she did not. A businessman on his way to Chicago for a meeting was killed. His wife learned of his death from a newspaper headline the next morning. A college student who had been visiting his family in California died in the second car. He had been studying engineering. He had taken a train because flying was too expensive. Some passengers were never identified. Their remains were interred in a mass grave near the crash site. The Union Pacific paid settlements to some families. The amounts were small. The company argued that the washout was an act of God and therefore not its fault. The families of the deceased challenged the railroad in court. The case lasted 3 years. The trial revealed that the Union Pacific had known about the washout risk for 15 years but had taken no action. The company's internal memos, produced under subpoena, showed that engineers had recommended additional drainage at milepost 347 in 1935. The recommendation was denied. The cost was estimated at $4,000. The company decided the risk was acceptable. The jury awarded the families a total of $200,000. The Union Pacific appealed. The case was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount. No one was fired. No policy was changed. The City of San Francisco disaster was not an isolated event. It was the product of a system that had been built to prioritize profit over safety. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed 70 years earlier, but the ethos of its construction had never been replaced. The same attitude that drove Chinese laborers to their deaths on the Sierra Nevada slopes was still present in the boardrooms of the 193s. The names had changed. The men were different. But the calculation remained the same. Risk was something to be managed, not eliminated. Workers were disposable, passengers were expectations. The railroad was a machine and machines could be repaired, the dead were not. By the 1940s, the Transcontinental Railroad was facing a new challenge. The automobile was becoming the preferred mode of travel. The federal government was building highways. The air travel industry was taking shape. The railroads responded by reducing costs, cutting services, and consolidating routes. They also reduced maintenance. The tracks that had been laid in the 1860s and 1870s were still in use in some places. The iron was worn. The ties were rotten, the bridges were corroded, the trains were faster but the infrastructure was older. The collision of speed and decay was inevitable. On the night of September 13, 1944, a Southern Pacific passenger train called the Pacific Limited derailed near Ogden, Utah. The train was traveling at 60 miles per hour when it hit a broken rail. The locomotive flipped. The cars telescoped. 38 people died. The broken rail had been identified as defective 3 days earlier. A track inspector had flagged it for replacement. The replacement was scheduled for the following week. The train was not warned. The investigation found that the railroad had a backlog of over 200 defective rails across its system. The company's repair crews were understaffed. The foreman responsible for scheduling repairs had been promoted 6 months earlier. He had no experience in track maintenance. The rail had been flagged twice before and ignored both times. The Interstate Commerce Commission report on the Pacific Limited disaster was scathing. It stated that the Southern Pacific's maintenance practices were grossly inadequate and that the company had systematically deferred necessary repairs. The commission recommended that the railroad be fined. The railroad's lawyers argued that the commission had no enforcement authority. They were correct. The commission could recommend, it could not compel. The Southern Pacific paid a fine of $10,000. The amount was less than the cost of replacing 1 mile of rail. The company continued to defer maintenance. The crashes continued. In 1946, a Union Pacific freight train derailed near Cheyenne, Wyoming. The train was carrying lumber and oil. The derailment caused a fire that burned for 2 days. The engineer and fireman died. The cause was a broken wheel. The wheel had been manufactured in 1900. It had been in service for 36 years. The railroad's maintenance records showed that the wheel had been inspected every 6 months. The inspections had been visual only. No one had removed the wheel to check for internal cracks. The crack that caused the failure was invisible from the outside. The railroad blamed the manufacturer. The manufacturer had gone out of business in 1932. The pattern was so consistent that it became a kind of dark arithmetic. The Transcontinental Railroad had been built on a foundation of human sacrifice. The sacrifice was not limited to the construction period. It continued for decades, hidden in the routine reports of accidents, the obituaries of workers, the lawsuits of families. The railroad companies had learned to calculate the cost of a life. They had determined, based on insurance rates and court settlements, that a dead worker was worth approximately $5,000. A dead passenger was worth slightly more. The cost of preventing deaths was higher, so they chose to pay for the deaths instead. The human toll was not evenly distributed. The poorest passengers traveled in the cheapest cars, which were at the front and back of the train, the places most likely to be destroyed in a collision or derailment. The workers who maintained the tracks were African American, Mexican American, and Chinese American. They were paid the lowest wages and given the most dangerous jobs. The survivors of these workers received no compensation. Their families were not mentioned in the corporate records. The census data from the early 20th century shows that the life expectancy of a railroad track worker was 50 years. The national average was 65. The system that allowed this to happen was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate decisions made by executives, politicians, and regulators. The railroad companies had lobbied against safety laws for decades. They had argued that the market would self-regulate. They had said that government intervention would destroy the industry. The government had listened. The Interstate Commerce Commission was created to regulate railroads, but it was stripped of enforcement power. The commission's staff was small, its budget was limited, its commissioners were often former railroad executives. The revolving door between the industry and the regulator was well known. It was not considered a problem. The Transcontinental Railroad's legacy was built on this imbalance. The Golden Spike was driven in 1869. By 1950, more than 30,000 railroad workers had been killed on the job. More than 100,000 passengers had died in train accidents. The numbers are estimates. The records were incomplete. The railroads did not maintain accurate accounts of their own failures. The government did not require them to. The dead were counted but not remembered. Their names were filed away in claim reports, insurance forms, and court documents. They were numbers on a ledger. The ledger was closed. The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was a testament to human ingenuity and human greed. It was a path through mountains and deserts built by men who were treated as machines. It was maintained by workers who were paid in pennies and buried in unmarked graves. It was ridden by passengers who trusted the system and died because that trust was not returned. The rail itself was iron and steel. It did not care about the lives it carried. The people who controlled it did care, but only as much as the law required. And the law required very little. In 1961, the Transcontinental Railroad celebrated its 92nd anniversary. The original route through Promontory Summit had long been abandoned. The new route through the Lucin Cutoff was still in operation. The trains were faster, the cars were more comfortable, the safety statistics had improved, but the underlying structure remained the same. The railroads were still private companies with limited oversight. The accidents still happened. The pattern still held. On the morning of June 24, 1962, a Union Pacific freight train derailed near the town of Rawlins, Wyoming. The train was carrying propane. The derailment caused a series of explosions that were heard 20 miles away. The crew escaped, but a nearby gas station was destroyed. The fire burned for 6 days. The investigation found that the derailment was caused by a loose joint in the track. The joint had been inspected 2 weeks earlier. The inspector had noted that the bolts were loose and recommended tightening. The recommendation was not followed. The joint was on a list of maintenance tasks that were considered low priority. The priority list was determined by the regional manager who had a budget to meet. The repair cost $50. The damage from the derailment cost $2 million. The question of who was responsible was never answered. The manager was not disciplined. The inspector was not blamed. The company issued a statement expressing regret and announcing new safety protocols. The protocols were not implemented. The accident was forgotten within a month. The news cycle moved on. The propane explosions became a footnote in the history of Wyoming. The Transcontinental Railroad is often remembered as a symbol of national achievement. The Golden Spike, the steam locomotives, the westward expansion, the triumph of engineering. These images are accurate, but they are incomplete. The other side of the story is one of exploitation, negligence, and death. The same ambition that built the road also built the system that allowed so many to die. The same corporations that celebrated the completion of the line also resisted every attempt to make that line safe. The same government that subsidized the construction of the railroad also failed to regulate it. The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast is still there. Parts of it are still in use. Union Pacific and BNSF Railway operate freight trains along the same corridors. The traffic is heavier. The trains are longer, the speed is higher. The risks remain. The track inspections are still conducted by human beings who can miss a crack. The wheels are still made of steel that can fatigue. The bridges are still subject to floodwaters. The dispatchers are still overwhelmed with data. The system is more sophisticated than it was in 1869, but it is not perfect. It is not designed to be perfect. It is designed to be profitable. In 2001, a Union Pacific train derailed near the site of the 1939 washout on the Humboldt River. The freight train was carrying hazardous chemicals. The derailment caused a spill that contaminated the river for 40 miles. The cause was a broken rail. The investigation revealed that the same stretch of track had been the site of 5 derailments in the previous 7 years. The railroad had not upgraded the rail. The cost of replacement was estimated at $3 million. The cost of the cleanup was estimated at $10 million. The railroad paid for the cleanup. The track was upgraded the following year. The question of why it needed a disaster to force an upgrade remained unanswered. The Transcontinental Railroad was not one road. It was thousands of miles of decisions, each one made in a specific context, each one reflecting a set of priorities. The priority was always speed and cost. The consequence was always someone's life. The Chinese workers who died in the tunnels of the Sierra Nevada, the Irish workers who drowned in the rivers of Utah, the track workers who were crushed by trains they could not hear, the passengers who trusted a system that did not trust them. The road connected them all. It connected the East Coast to the West Coast. It connected ambition to tragedy. It connected progress to loss. The Golden Spike was driven at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869. The spike was made of gold. It was hammered into a time made of polished laurel wood. The ceremony was attended by dignitaries and journalists. The telegraph sent a single word across the country, done. That word meant that the railroad was complete. It meant that the East Coast and the West Coast were linked by iron. It did not mean that the work was finished. The work of maintaining the road, of repairing the track, of caring for the people who used it was only beginning. That work is still not finished. The road is still there. The questions are still unanswered. But the questions do not disappear. They recur. At 2:47 a.m. on July 11, 1989, a Union Pacific freight train derailed near the town of Elko, Nevada. The train was 120 cars long. It was carrying ammonium nitrate, a chemical used in fertilizer and explosives. The lead locomotive was a brand new and.This D60. The crew consisted of an engineer and a conductor. They had departed from Salt Lake City 12 hours earlier, heading west towards Sparks. The weather was clear, the track was dry, everything seemed routine. At 2:47 a.m., the engineer felt a sudden lurch. The locomotive pitched to the left. He applied the emergency brakes, but it was too late. The train had already begun to pile up. The cars behind the engine jackknifed and derailed. The ammonium nitrate cars overturned. Within minutes, a fire started. The fire spread rapidly. The chemical ignited in a series of explosions that shook the ground for miles. Windows shattered in Elko 7 miles away. The crew escaped the locomotive and ran for cover. The fire burned for 3 days. The evacuation zone covered a radius of 10 miles. 2,000 residents were forced to leave their homes. No one died. That was considered a miracle, but the damage was extensive. The track was destroyed over a stretch of 2 miles. The estimated cost of cleanup and repair was $30 million. The railroad declared the derailment an accident. The local community demanded an investigation. The National Transportation Safety Board sent a team to Elko. They arrived on the morning of July 12th. They began examining the wreckage. What they found was not surprising to anyone who had studied the history of the Transcontinental Railroad. The derailment was caused by a broken rail. The rail had been manufactured in 197 on. It had been installed in 1973. By 1989, it had carried an estimated 60 million gross tons of freight. The rail had developed internal fatigue cracks. These cracks were invisible to the naked eye. They could only be detected by ultrasonic testing equipment. The railroad had conducted ultrasonic testing on that section of track in 1987. The test results had shown no defects. But the testing equipment was not calibrated for the type of rail used in the 1970s. The manufacturer had changed the steel composition without notifying the railroads. The testing equipment was designed for older, softer steel. The new steel was harder but more brittle. The cracks propagated faster. The test missed them. The NTSB investigation also revealed that the track had been inspected visually 2 weeks before the derailment. The inspector had noted that the tie plates were loose. He had recommended replacement of 9 ties. That recommendation was not acted upon. The ties were considered low priority. The inspector was not informed of the need for ultrasonic testing. The railroad's maintenance database did not flag the section as high risk. The system was designed to prioritize repairs that affected train speed, not safety. A loose tie plate was a minor issue. A broken rail was a catastrophe. The connection between the two was not made until after the derailment. The investigation dragged on for months. The NTSB issued its final report in early 1990. The report listed the probable cause as a broken rail due to fatigue cracking. It also cited inadequate inspection procedures and insufficient communication between maintenance crews and track inspectors. The railroad accepted the findings and promised to improve. The improvements were incremental. The ultrasonic testing equipment was updated, the inspection intervals were shortened, but the fundamental structure remained the same. The railroad was still a private company with a primary goal of moving freight as cheaply as possible. Safety was a cost. The trade-off was real. Elko derailment was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that stretched back 120 years. The same economic pressures that had driven the Chinese workers to their deaths in the 1860s were still present in 1989. The same logic that had allowed the Central Pacific to use substandard materials still operated. The industry had changed. The locomotives were diesel, the rails were continuous welded, the brakes were air-operated, but the math was the same. A new rail cost money, a derailment cost more money, but only if it happened. The probability of a derailment was low. The cost of prevention was certain. The companies chose certainty over risk. The families of the Elko victims did not exist in the same way as the families of the Chinese workers. No one died in 1989, but there were victims nonetheless. The local businesses lost revenue. The residents lost their sense of security. The environment was contaminated. The cleanup crews worked for months, removing contaminated soil and rebuilding the track. The community filed a lawsuit against Union Pacific. The lawsuit was settled out of court for an undisclosed sum. The settlement included a confidentiality agreement. The railroad did not admit fault. The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast continued to carry freight. By the turn of the millennium, the traffic had increased dramatically. The Transcontinental Corridor was one of the busiest freight routes in the world. Trains ran every 20 minutes in some sections. The average length of a freight train had grown to more than 2 miles. The total tonnage had tripled since 1950, yet the basic infrastructure had not kept pace. The bridges were aging, the tunnels were narrow, the signals were outdated, the dispatchers were overworked. The same tension between speed and safety that defined the 1860s defined the 2000s. On December 18, 2005, a Union Pacific train derailed near the town of Colfax, California on the same line that had been built by Chinese laborers. The train was carrying lumber and steel. The derailment destroyed a historic bridge that had been built in 1900. The bridge was a trestle structure made of timber and iron. It had been inspected annually. The inspections had noted that the timber was rotting, the iron was corroding, the bridge was rated as structurally deficient. But the railroad did not replace it. The cost of a new bridge was estimated at $5 million. The cost of a derailment was estimated at $3 million. The railroad chose to accept the lower risk. The bridge collapsed under the train. The train fell into the canyon below. The crew survived by jumping from the locomotive. The fire burned for 2 days. The investigation found that the bridge's timber piles had been weakened by dry rot. The rot had been identified in a 1999 inspection. The railroad had scheduled repairs for 2000, then delayed them to 2001, then canceled them entirely. The reasoning was simple. The bridge had not failed yet. It was still carrying trains. The probability of failure was considered low. The probability was low until it became a certainty. The pattern repeated itself across the corridor. In 2012, a BNSF train derailed near the town of Modoc, Kansas, on the original route of the Kansas Pacific. The cause was a broken joint on a rail that had been installed in 1950. The rail was 58 years old. The railroad had a policy of replacing rail after 50 years, but the policy was a guideline, not a requirement. The rail had not been replaced because the train traffic on that section was light. The derailment killed no one, but it shut down the line for 3 days. The economic loss was measured in millions. The rail was replaced the following year. The Transcontinental Railroad is not a single line. It is a network of lines, each with its own history, its own failures, and its own lessons. The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast was more than a physical track. It was a system of decisions. The decisions were made by people who were not evil but who were constrained by budgets, deadlines, and competition. The system incentivized cutting corners. The system punished those who spoke out. The system was designed to ignore the long-term consequences. The consequences accumulated over decades. They became the broken rails, the collapsed bridges, the derailed trains, and the dead workers. The golden spike was driven in 1869. The questions about who paid for the road, who built it, and who died for it were never fully answered. The questions about who maintains it, who inspects it, and who profits from it remain open. The road is still there. The trains are still running. The derailments are still happening. The investigations are still producing the same findings. The recommendations are still ignored. The pattern persists. The road that connected the East Coast to the West Coast is a monument to ambition, to industry, and to the human cost of progress. It is also a reminder that progress does not end. The costs continue to be paid. The questions continue to be asked. And the answers, when they come, are always too late.